Wonderful. Welcome everyone to the Society of Gender Professionals. My name is Christy Kelly and I'm a member of the startup team and we'll be getting us started today. Thank you all for joining us. We've had quite a large number of people registering, so we're excited to see that this topic, beyond the binaries in international development, is of interest to so many people from all over the world. As people come into the room, we invite them to introduce themselves by chatting in the chat box. Let us know who you are and where you're joining from. This is a great way for people to start meeting each other from different parts of the world. Next slide. For those of you new to the Society of Gender Professionals, we are an organization. We started about 2 years ago with a very broad mission to promote the development of intersectional gender expertise for professional practice, to strengthen connections between gender theory, policy, and practice, to support member collaboration, network building, mentoring, and leadership, to foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research, and to provide a platform for the exchange of gender information and resources. Our Gender Café, which you're part of today, is part of this platform. In short, our goal is to raise the expertise of gender as expertise and to create a global community of people working as academics, practitioners, and activists in the field. Next slide. We have over 1,800 registered members, and you can see on the map, those countries in yellow are where our members are currently located. We are in over 151 countries, many of you joining us today from around the world. Next slide. Gender cafes are one of the many things that SGP supports in terms of creating connections between practitioners, academics, and activists. Gender cafes are non-hierarchical sharing spaces, spaces that we bring together experts in different areas to help us learn beyond a typical classroom experience. Our goal is to raise the profile of gender expertise and create professional development opportunities for our members interested in new topics related to their work. Next slide. Today we're using Zoom as a platform for engaging. If you are new to Zoom, welcome. We hope that this is a little bit of opportunity for you to get to know the space. After we have a presentation from our panelists, we'll be breaking up into 3 separate breakout rooms for smaller discussion. Each of our panelists will lead one of those discussions. At that point, you will see on your computer screen or your phone an invitation to join the breakout room. All you have to do is click on the breakout room icon there and you'll automatically go to the room. Our discussions will take place over 20 minutes and you will be automatically returned to the main room. So no need to do anything but select the option to join when you see that. Next slide. So now let's get started. Let me introduce our moderator today, Tao Nguyen. Can I have the next slide, please? Tao is a researcher based in Washington, D.C. She holds an MA in sociology from the University of Chicago and a BA in global studies from Randolph College. We're really excited because Tao came to SGP with the idea for this cafe and has identified some really wonderful people to present with her on this topic and to open conversation for us. So I will turn it over to you, Tao. Thank you so much for facilitating our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Christy. It's my honor to be here today with our brilliant panelists, and also I see some familiar faces in the audience. So I identify as a qualitative sociologist, and I'm currently based in DC. I just finished my master, and also a central focus of my work is to change the misconceptions about the adult industry and to make distinctions between consensual adult sex work and sex trafficking. And I'm passionate about changing the narrative around LGBTQAI+ communities, many of whom are excluded from the mainstream economy and work in the sex industry. Next slide, please. And it's my honor to introduce to you one of our panelists, Dr. Heather Tucker. Dr. Heather Tucker is an academic from the Global North, but Heather has conducted research in the Global South. And for our panel, we aim to have a mix of both researchers and practitioners who come from both the Global North and the Global South. Heather, could you please tell us a little bit about your work? Heather?
Yes, thank you, Thao. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to the panel. I currently am based in Missouri, and I work as a researcher and gender consultant. I most recently finished my doctoral dissertation at in gender comparative studies at Central European University, and this research was focused on using feminist and queer ethnographic methods to look at the ways in which queer women were involved in or not in LGBT funding and transnational spaces. And my current passion is to use this knowledge to also work with organizations on the way in which and how they implement programming and policy. And I'm happy to talk to anyone in any organization about this passion and offer this expertise. And you're welcome to email me at the end of this.
Thank you, Heather. We are very excited to have you today. And next slide, please. And our second distinguished guest is Nish Maglin, who is a practitioner in the Global South, but Nish works for an organization that is based in the Global North. As you can tell from all of our backgrounds, the binary between the Global North and the Global South is blurry and it's not very clear-cut. Nish, could you please tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Sure, thank you, Tal. Hi, everyone. So I'm based in Jamaica. I'm in the Caribbean, and I work for Outright Action International as their Caribbean program officer. So I'm basically in charge of our work across the Caribbean region. Two main parts of our work at the moment has to do with a project on gender-based violence, particularly as it impacts and affects LGBTQ people and women. For me, as a person that lives beyond the binary, as a transmasculine person, I'm also invested in the work around ensuring that trans people are seen, are affirmed, and there are opportunities for queer people to live and exist and celebrate beyond the binary. Thank you, Tal.
Next slide, please. And to start off our conversation, we would like to provide a brief intro for people who may not be familiar with the concept of gender binaries. And also to keep everyone on the same page, we also want to provide some grounding for our conversation. So as you can see on the slide, this is the definition of gender binary, and the idea that there are only two opposite genders is called gender binary, and gender like sexuality exists on a spectrum. Some people don't neatly fit into the categories of men or woman or male or female, and for example, some people have a gender that blends elements of being a man and a woman, and also a gender that is different than either male or female, and some people don't identify with any gender, and some people's genders changes over time. And why are we having this conversation today? Although both gender and sexual minorities face intersecting patriarchal oppression, international development frameworks take gender binaries for granted and do not recognize trans and other gender non-conforming identities. Development organizations also that are claiming to be gender transformative also continue to perpetuate gender binaries across their gender work, which is counterproductive to tackling the challenges that sexual minorities face. And next slide, please. And now we will officially kick off our panel discussion, where our guests will talk about what gender binaries capture and do not capture, and what are missing from these rigid gender binaries. Ask what are the practical tools and resources that we could use to make radical. And our goal for today is to break out the rigid gender in development work and also to gain practical elements of increasing knowledge of sexual and gender diversity, LGBTQAI plus people on the ground, as well as more structural understanding of heteronormative patriarchy and rigid gendered constructions. Next slide, please. And the first question will be for Heather. Heather, could you please talk about what are the mainstream approaches to working on gender binaries in development?
Thank you, Tao. Typically the mainstream approaches in development, as many of us know, rely on the gender binary itself. A lot of interventions around gender-based violence are typically targeted to those who are categorized as women. And there are lots of interventions typically in development which have been written about and analyzed as reconstructing the binary. So there's a large assumption that when programs are implemented on the ground, that these are reaching typically heteronormative families. Without saying so, there's an assumption that there is a particular heteronormative family structure for the intervention to reach. And one example I also wanted to mention today was that some of the mainstream work that is challenging and engaging with the gender binary in terms of what we understand to be the binary of man and woman, that this work, the work around engaging men and boys, engages with, in terms of intervening around sexual and gender-based violence in particular, has an understanding and an analysis of masculinities in the work, but typically lacks an intersectional approach, which would further highlight the ways in which gender binaries also rely on heteronormative binaries. And the ways in which this challenging masculinities also includes challenging heteronormativity. So what I would be interested in, or what this discussion might lead to, and does lead to, is the idea that these mainstream approaches are sort of identifying the gender binary itself at times, but however, there seems to be a lack of focus or a linkage between these gender binaries and this particular work, and looking at the ways in which sexuality, for example, or gender identity are also a part of challenging gender-based violence. And in fact, there's a linkage there between interventions around masculinities and sexual and gender-based violence, and understanding those linkages with the ways in which people are marginalized due to their sexuality and or gender identity.
Could you please provide some clarification or elaboration on what is heteronormativity?
Yeah, sure, sorry. Heteronormative, how I understand heteronormativity is the idea that we see that heterosexuality in particular, and a heterosexual family structure is the norm, and that's perceived as a given. And this, in fact, creates invisibilization and also marginalization of those who don't conform to these particular family structures, but also to particular gender roles within a heterosexual framework.
Thank you so much. And next slide, please. And the next question will be for Nish. What are the gaps in the mainstream, now that we have known what the mainstream approaches to working on gender binaries are? Anish, could you please tell us about what are the gaps in those approaches and who are being impacted and marginalized by gender binaries?
Thank you, Tal. And Dr. Heather Tucker sets a great framework in terms of looking at, you know, what are the mainstream approaches, because it does feed exactly into what the gaps are. And I'll start by talking about who are impacted by gender binaries. So basically, trans people, you know, gender non-conforming people, non-binary are very much affected by gender binaries, and as well other persons who may exist within the binaries, but don't have the opportunity to explore and express themselves. So typically toxic masculinity creates a huge challenge, especially so in the Caribbean, where, you know, men and boys are policed. Their behaviors, their actions are policed in general by society. And so it feeds into some of the gaps that exist in terms of language and the ability to explore identities beyond the binary. So the erasure of and invisibilization of trans persons and persons who exist outside the binary feeds into the issues that we face in the Caribbean region and globally as well. When we talk about language, when we look at families, the cis hetero structures exclude families that are diverse. And even so, to families with a single parent, which in the Caribbean, many families have single parent, but the idea that nuclear family structure is the norm as well is a misconception. Additionally, when we look at how language erases trans people, when we look at the idea that for language that looks at family structures, we don't talk necessarily about transmasculine people, or we don't talk necessarily about trans men who can become pregnant. So there are many different ways in which the idea of the recent discussion with always around periods and their branding to expand to be inclusive, that created quite some negative feedback in our region, because the idea that a woman is the only one, or a cis woman, a cisgender woman is the only type of person who can have a period. So the gaps exist within policies as well, because policies continue to erase people who are gender non-conforming, people who exist outside the binaries. Even when we look at identity documents, the idea that it states male or female, many identity documents don't include gender. So the idea that we need to include both sex and gender in the conversation is also a part of the different steps that we need to take. So I think to a larger extent, we also need to include as well masculine presenting women, because masculinity is not inherently tied to cisgender men. And that again is a part of the issue and the conversation that we need to have.
Thank you so much, Nish. Next slide, please. So the next question will be for Heather. What tools, in your opinion, what tools and ethics are useful in facilitating changes or shifts regarding rigid gender binaries? And the second question is, how can we do the least harm in our work?
Thank you, Tao, and thank you, Nish, for elaborating on that particular question and sharing examples. It's really helpful. In particular, I think researchers and organizations from the North, which are typically what happens in development, is that there's a Northern organization or donor that's interested in intervening. And in my case, or in the past, I was a researcher from the North interested in doing research in the South. And there are quite a lot of researchers who are interested in doing the same kind of work. I've found through different avenues who have reached out to me. And I think it's because it's such an important topic, and it's in terms of organizations wanting to do more intersectional work and to be more inclusive in terms of how they're looking at the different ways in which people are marginalized in different contexts. I think that the idea of doing intersectional work is very important and should be taken seriously. However, in terms of researchers and organizations from the North actually implementing their interventions and their research, I think it's critical to understand, or to come from a place of understanding that this actually, these interventions and the research can, if not if not following an ethical guideline and or do no harm, for example, approach, there can be harm that is done on the ground because it's such a sensitive, it can be a sensitive subject. And in particular, in a lot of contexts, this is a sexuality in particular, which is conflated with gender. Gender diversity in many places is still considered criminal, and we can have another discussion about the fact that that's a particular colonial inheritance in a lot of contexts. But in terms of basically what I wanted to say today is that while well-intentioned, these interventions and the idea of doing an ethical programming and or ethical research, the idea of do no harm, I think is critical in order to actually address and create information about what's going on for people, and to create interventions that do not cause further violence and or vulnerability to individuals. And I think one example, and I can share this resource later, and I see we actually have someone from Plan International here with us. Plan International recently put together a really interesting publication addressing this subject in particular, about how to ethically approach programming in interventions, and having a do no harm approach with LGBTQIA plus persons in programming. And I think it's a really great example of a document that is pretty nuanced in thinking about how to do these interventions. And I think one of the examples is also from my own research, is that before beginning the intervention, to really assess your own positionality, the positionality of the organization itself, and the power dynamic already in place in terms of how that's going to play out on the ground. And this would include, you know, engaging one of these. This self-reflection includes listening to and being willing to listen to criticism on the ground, but also to identify and work alongside those on the ground who are most vulnerable. And I think the organizations that are doing the critical work, being a part of and collaborating with those who are doing the interventions, and not just in an extractive way where a researcher or a program comes in to gather data and then leave, but that there's actually intention to have an ongoing conversation that's mutually beneficial, and includes criticism from both sides and mutual feedback, but also a real ability to embrace the positionality of being from the North, and how, especially around the concept of sexuality and gender, that this is also a very this is a conversation about power historically. So it requires an immense amount of understanding of one's ability, even with good intentions, to actually enact cultural imperialism or have a lack of awareness of the impacts of one's work and positionality. And I'll stop there. We can have more conversations about this in the breakout rooms.
As a researcher, I also have to do. I really agree, and also I'm thankful for what you were sharing, because as a researcher, it's very important to think about what kind of impact your research is making on the communities that you want to research, and also I think it's very critical to have a self-reflective as you continue, as you do your own research, or implement your programs. Yeah. The next question will be for Nish. How can we bridge the gap between women's rights and LGBTQIA+ rights, and what are the ethical approaches?
All right, thank you so much, Tal, and thank you, Dr. Tucker, again. I think you really raised some very salient points. I was nodding quite a lot along with what you were saying. And I really want to, what you said about intersectional work being important and should be taken seriously, particularly to do no harm, are like the central points that I really want to echo. Because I think that once we move from that framing, we understand that meaningful engagement and collaboration is a starting point. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethical approaches and then how we can bridge some of the gaps. And so the starting point is to ensure that engagement, meaningful engagement and collaboration is a starting point to the core of the ethical standards that we create. Because indeed, when we work and engage with vulnerable, marginalized people and communities, we really have to ask ourselves certain questions in order to interrogate if our approaches are ethical. We should ask ourselves, what is the level of burden we're placing on vulnerable and marginalized people to tell their stories. Because for me in particular, as the executive director of Transwave Jamaica, which is based in Jamaica, and we promote trans health and wellness here. There are many researchers or academics who will come to the organization, to require stories to be shared. And some of the information being requested is very sensitive. And so we need to ask, how is the engagement benefiting the communities that we are researching? Like Dr. Tucker said, what are we leaving behind, or how are we sustaining the engagement that we are seeking to have? And how do we safeguard against exploitation and ensure that the research feeds into advocacy actions? Because the research cannot be the endpoint. It has to be somewhat of the starting point, and then we have to therefore engage with communities ethically in terms of how the research will impact their livelihood, if how their words are used, and how that resonates with them. And therefore we can bridge the gap by starting to recognize the intersectionality of women's rights and LGBTQIA plus rights. And we have to therefore recognize that there is solidarity in our movements, particularly around issues such as gender-based violence, climate change, sexual and reproductive health. And these are indeed shared concerns, and it requires partnership and collaboration. Um, and so the movements need to work together and also recognize that our identities exist beyond those. They're not extremes, right? So the binaries of women's rights and LGBTQI rights, there are overlaps within both communities. And so working together to ensure that how we advance the work of communities beyond the binaries takes a very collaborative and intersectional approach. So I'll stop there as well, and I'll be more than happy to continue the conversation in the breakout session.
Thank you so much, Nish. And as a feminist, I can totally resonate with that, because I think in our work, normally we forget to collaborate with other people. So I think taking a collaborative approach and also is essential to being feminist, intersectional feminist, feminist or queer. And next question, thank you, Nish. Next slide, please. So the next question will be for both Nish and Heather. How can we move beyond the gender binaries and facilitate radical change in our frameworks for gender analysis, evaluations, audits from an intersectional feminist or queer perspectives?
Thank you, Dao, and thank you, Nish, for, again, giving some really critical examples of sort of the practical ways in which on the ground, working around issues such as gender intersectionally, how that actually challenges a lot of the mainstream approaches that happen in development interventions, and that there is actually a particular way to address not only challenging one's understanding of gender itself, but also challenging one's understanding of intersectionality, and then taking it a step further and challenging the way in which we typically do work, and looking at the ways in which we can make work transformative. And in particular, speaking from my positionality as a Northern researcher and a queer feminist researcher, acknowledging, I say this a lot, but I think it's important, and acknowledging one's position in a position of power, and the ability to, that is a starting point in terms of even beginning to think about the ways in which, from my position, that I think about gender and I think about sexuality to begin with, but also how I think about intersectionality, and that there's so much to learn, particularly from people in the context. But taking it a step further, as you mentioned, how do we do that in a way that's not extractive, that's not harmful, that's not exhausting communities that are typically targeted by interventions? I think this is something that comes up a lot. It came up in my research, and I'm sure you mentioned it, but it comes up a lot, I think, for organizations that work on these issues in the South, that there is an inundation. People are inundated, and organizations are inundated with people coming in and wanting, well-meaning, but wanting to do interventions, and then sort of exhausting the community in terms of extracting research. And so what is the end point of that, and what are the limitations of that, and is it in fact important to do that work? Is that the point of the intervention itself? I think there's just a lot of considerations that are important, that can be managed if one is willing to understand sort of the larger power dynamics, but also to be guided by those who have been working on the ground, who have been dealing with these issues in the everyday, and who are interested in change, of course. And as you mentioned, taking research from its place of just being information that's about the community, but taking that research and actually implementing it into something that's practical and creates a sustainable sort of advocacy tool for people on the ground. So how do we create these sorts of relationships, but also this sort of accessible information for people? One of the questions that I have for researchers, I mean, including myself, where does the research go, and does the community even receive that information about themselves so that they can use that as their own tools for whatever it is that they want to do? And I think one more thing I wanted to mention is, again, that these changes, the radical changes or the idea of transformation, has to be led by the people that it impacts. It cannot be set by a Northern-based organization, this agenda, right? I know there's a delicate balance there where people are dealing with donors who want information and they want to do specific interventions, but how do we balance that power dynamic with actual people's lives on the ground?
All right, thank you. So you wanted to go ahead? Okay. All right. So really appreciate that, Dr. Tucker, like quite exceptional. And I'll just finish up by sharing, just based on what you just said, that the power dynamics. I think that resonates because I agree. I think we need to be able to, in order for us to create transformative change, we need to be able to shift that power dynamic and give the power back to the people on the ground, right? The trans persons, queer people, whose stories we tell. Because at the end of the day, actually, our communities, my community, can tell our own stories. The resources is often what is lacking, and not the expertise. So the expertise is there. And so if we, as researchers and as practitioners and academics, if we wish to collaborate with communities, then it has to be done in a very equal way. And understanding that to go further beyond research, therefore means that we need to help communities create avenues to use the information as activism. So I like what you said, Dr. Turk, about if the research is done, do the communities even get the findings or get the information? Because that information is extremely powerful, research actually can make a difference and has been making a difference. Oftentimes governments fail to act because they often say, well, where's the data? We don't have the information. And so I really encourage people to recognize that the research itself can be transformative, and development agencies who seek to engage beyond the binary can utilize the research and can invest in the power and diversity that exists beyond the binary in order to shift their frameworks. So that's what I'll say for now until we head over to the breakout room.
Thank you so much, Nish and Heather, for your insights and expertise. So I saw that there are a few questions in the chat. We will either address that in the breakout session, or at the end, if we have a few minutes left, we can address those questions. And those are very great questions and thought-provoking. And thank you for raising them. So now we will be heading to the breakout section, and there will be enough. There will be 10 to 11 people per room, and each of the discussion group will be facilitated by Nish, Heather, and myself, and also other members from SGP as well. And we will see you shortly in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. You should be receiving an invitation to a breakout room. If you do not see the invitation, just stay here and we'll figure out the technology problem. Welcome back, everyone. We'll give a minute to make sure everyone has made it safely back to the main room. It sounds like you had some very interesting conversations. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask each room to report just 1 or 2 minutes very briefly what you talked about, and then we'll make sure to record and have summary notes that everyone will receive after this event, since we won't have as much time to present as we would like. Tao, may I ask you to go first?
Yeah, sure. My group didn't have enough time to finish the whole conversation, so I'm sorry to everyone who got cut off. So I would like to give the mic to someone in my group to say what we discussed about. Does anyone in the group wants to talk about what we like? Just give like 1 or 2 sentences of summary of what we discussed. Alison, Noel, or Leah, or Mariana at the end. If no one,
I can jump in. It's Leah. So we had kind of like 2 different discussions. One sort of about that organizations are saying that they're inclusive and recognizing like diverse groups across like LGBTIQA communities, but that they're still don't understand even the basic difference between gender and sexuality. And in some ways, they're still just reinforcing the gender binary through their programming, even though they're claiming to be inclusive. And then we sort of got in a bit of a tangential conversation about the engaging men and boys work, which is a whole separate thing. But those were the 2 basic conversations.
thank you, Leah.
Thank you. Nish, would you like to report from your room, please?
Sure. So we had a nice conversation. We had quite a few feedback from people in terms of questions. We spoke mostly about how to encourage buy-in from higher ups and leadership teams, particularly around the intersectionality that exists in QI rights and women's rights. And we also talked a bit about work being done in Kampala and how we can work in spaces that are quite stigmatized and where people are often persecuted when we're looking to try to prevent violence against women and girls. And we also talked a little bit about the history of colonialization or colonialism and the historical perception that exists in that space, and how the social norms and social context makes it difficult for people. So that was the general framing of our conversation.
Thank you very much. Heather, I'll turn it over to you next.
Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation in which a couple of the attendees, Rebecca and Lindsay, both shared some of their practical experiences as as practitioners, and in particular, Rebecca shared with us, she works for World Learning. They have developed an actual toolkit, which would be a great resource for people to know about. It's called TAP, and it's actually about doing intersectional work around these issues, in particular gender and sexuality. And it's an open source resource, and it's also a part of, or coming out of that work is a community of practice. So sharing how this is actually working out for the staff themselves, but how it's also being implemented on the ground. And so we talked about the different layers of the work that there's actually this this huge effort and project to educate staff, and then that's just the beginning, and getting staff to work around a specific language, but then also, does this translate into the context that you're working, and how does it actually get implemented ethically? And then Lindsay actually also shared a really great resource, which hopefully we can put all these together somewhere, on the issue of decolonizing gender. So looking at starting the topic from a point of view that the gender binaries themselves are actually linked to colonialism, and having a conversation with the right audience at the right time about how these issues can be unpacked in that way. So it was a really interesting conversation.
Great, thank you so much. I encourage everyone, as we're exiting the room here, to please include links to the resources, references, websites, anything you can in the chat box. We'll make sure to summarize all of the resources and send these out to everyone who's registered. SGP will also be soon hosting a resources page on our website so that people can continue to contribute to this conversation. Next slide, please. We'll just wrap up here and apologize for not having nearly as much time as we would like, but this has been a great conversation. I want to thank Nish and Heather, and especially Tao, for kickstarting the conversation today. This is just the beginning. Can I go to the next slide, please? As we continue the conversation, please do join SGP, where we have resource pages available. We will also be making this a link to this recording available on the website, as well as resources. Everyone who registered today, whether or not you were able to attend, will get a copy to the link to the PowerPoint, final notes and summaries, as well as a link to the recording. So we want to make this as open access as possible and encourage others to join the conversation. You can also reach out to Heather and Nish and Tao. Their emails were included on the PowerPoint. We'll send a reminder, so that if you'd like to find out more about their work or invite them directly into the work you're doing, we really encourage that. We also have learning circles within SGP, and we'll be kickstarting one on Beyond the Binaries. So we encourage, again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. We really look forward to seeing this grow. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.